There are a lot of baseball sims out there. But did you know that they all share the same common ancestor? You know, it's kind of funny to think that somebody had to actually invent the baseball sim. I mean, I would think at least that this is something that would have always existed, but it didn't. As you can see from this obscure illustration, the concept of tabletop baseball is nothing new. This comes from 1866. That's 3 years before the first official professional baseball team was formed. However, the game described here is not a dice-operated game. This game is a penny and spring-operated game, almost like a primitive form of pinball. This article goes on to explain that the game itself retailed for $5, but you could get it for $2.50 if you ordered it through this weekly newspaper. That paltry $2.50 in 1866 is the equivalent of about $50 today. Okay, if you're like me, you really don't care about games like that. I mean, these are obscure pinball type games. They called them parlor games back in those days. But I don't care about that so much. I'm interested in games that actually try to realistically simulate baseball. And if you're like me, you're mostly interested in dice games. See, if you look closely at those old so-called parlor baseball games, you'll realize that they tended to use spinner mechanisms. There are a lot more games like this out there than you might think. In that sense, the famous Ethan Allen All-Star Baseball was just a continuation of a very long tradition. And as anybody who has tried the spinner games can assure you, those spinners have a frustrating tendency to get stuck. Well, that's the reason why some designers back then decided to focus on making games that use dice. Now, though there certainly were kids who enjoyed playing All-Star Baseball, the truth is that the market in general slowly pushed its way towards dice as the principal randomizing mechanism. This game, League Parlor Baseball, was the first dice-activated commercial baseball game that we know of. It was sold in 1884. If you look through enough old 1884 newspapers, you can find it mentioned in department store ads, like this one for Dickinson's Bazaar on Nicollet Avenue in Minneapolis. Even when I zoom in, it might take you a little while to find the ad. The game apparently retailed for 95 cents, much better than the $5 they wanted for that game in 1866. League Parlor Baseball used a single die with 4 numbers and 2 O's. The O's represented outs. There were no player cards to speak of. It's not until our national baseball game came out in 1886 that we see the first commercial version of what we'd consider true dice baseball. This was initially played with 2 dice. The dice would be of the same size and both would be white. You'd read the dice according to which of the 2 had the lowest number first. That gives you a total of 21 combinations. And this really was the beginning of dice baseball, all the way back in 1886. Now, the vast majority of dice baseball games that have come out since have used a similar mechanic. 2 or sometimes 3 dice are rolled and combined, not added, to give us 21 combinations. You can find a lot of examples of this system. Armstead's Play Ball, for example, used the exact same dice system, though with a different game board. The great American game, Pocket Dice Baseball, used a similar activation structure, though the results shown here are clearly incomplete. Even Sean Smith, the creator of WAR, and somebody I've criticized here before, has his own version of this ancient game. Okay, by the way, big kudos to Sean Smith, who just published a book on how WAR is calculated. I'll have more on that later once I get it ordered and read. Anyway, though there were literally dozens of these old dice baseball games, there is one in particular that stands out above the rest. The game I'm talking about is this one, Steel's Inside Baseball, which first came out in 1913. If you search through newspapers from 1913 to about 1916, you'll find tons of ads like this. And the marketing campaign stretched throughout the United States, including this ad in the Grand Forks Daily Herald up in North Dakota. That newspaper is dated October 15, 1915. This game seems to have received a larger ad campaign than any other tabletop baseball game until the 1950s. Charles Steele, who was the man behind this game, was an advertising executive with the Ford Motor Company. I don't know the story behind this game, and I only know a couple things about Charles Steele that I saw in some really old biographical articles from this era. I'm assuming that Steele played some form of dice baseball when he was a kid, and that he thought this would be a good side hustle. You know, he could make some money from people who were kids in the 19 teens by selling them the same thing. Now, I'm not sure if Steele wrote like memoirs or an autobiography or not. Perhaps somebody out there can help me. Steele's game used 3 dice, not 2, and read them in the same order as the other dice baseball games. That is, the smallest die first, numbers combined and not added. Steele's game was also known for having different results for different on-base situations. I know that there were other games designed like this in the 1920s, but I suspect that Steele's was the first with this on-base situation setup. If you pay attention, you'll also notice that there is a pattern to the results. The only way you can hit a home run was by rolling triple sixes. Triple ones and triple threes would give you a triple. Triple twos, triple fours, and triple fives would give you a double, and then there were singles mixed throughout. The other important thing to notice is that Steele filed for a patent in 1913, and the patent was granted in 1914. So you're probably wondering why I'm spending so much time talking about this game, right? If you remember the thumbnail, we're here to talk about National Pastime, which is a totally different game, right? Well, this will make sense in a second. Well, the true focus of this video is the game created by this man, Clifford Van Beek. Van Beek was born in October 1903 and would have been about 10 years old when Steele's game first hit the market. In September 1923, at only 19 years old, Van Beek submitted a patent application for a dice baseball game of his own. The patent was granted in 1925. This game eventually came to market in 1930 under the name National Pastime. I need to pause here to note that there were other board games also called National Pastime. If you played a game called National Pastime when you were a kid, chances are very good that it wasn't this one. A lot of people seem to be confused on this point. This 1946 game, for example, was also called National Pastime and was produced by a major company, not the grocer from Green Bay. And this game, as nice as it looks, is not the one that we're talking about. The folks over at the Baseball Games website list 3 different games called National Pastime, but we only care about the first one. This is the National Pastime game we care about in all of its original glory. Now, the first thing that set National Pastime apart was the fact that there were individual player cards. You know, these were cards that represented how individual players performed. In the old dice baseball system, all players had the same chance of doing everything. You really had to use your imagination, and of course, it really wasn't worth keeping stats. In National Pastime, however, players were represented by these individual cards. The black numbers on these cards represented dice rolls, using only 2 dice, I should add, and note that the dice were also combined. What Van Beek did is he sent games out with 1 large white die and 1 small white die, and the large one was read first. Now, the red numbers on the side corresponded to results on playing boards using a matrix system. Playing boards would then give you the result. There were a total of 41 possible different red numbers, which we refer to as play result numbers, and each different on-base situation provided different play results. Now, there were some patterns. Play results numbers 1 through 11 were always hits, for example. 7 through 11 were always singles, 1 was always a home run, but 2 through 6 would vary depending upon the situation. 13 was always a strikeout, and 14 was always a walk. And play result numbers 36 through 40 seem to have always been strange events, usually things that didn't take up an at-bat. I won't go into too much detail here. If you're really curious, I have a lot of analytical detail on my Baseball Replay Journal blog. Instead of digging too deep, let's take a look at how the boards were originally laid out. Though the photo is a bit distant, the layout of the board should look familiar to you. Look at Steele's game again. If you look at the 2 side by side, you can clearly see where Van Beek likely got his inspiration. There are other interesting similarities. For example, the patents of both games use the awkward phrase "none on bases" to describe results with the bases empty. Also, recall that triple sixes made a home run in Steele's game, triple ones and threes a triple, and triple twos, fours, and fives a double. National Pastime is similar. 66 is the best dice roll. In this case, it's a home run. 11 tends to be second best, 33 third best, and then 22, 44, and sort of 55 are more or less equal in the pecking order. The difference, of course, is that some players were better hitters than others. Pitcher Jesse Haynes, for example, will not hit as well as James Bottomley. And that's what makes this game so exciting and so relevant. This is the first game, at least that I'm aware of, that crossed that line between ordinary parlor game, where you had to imagine everything and where you could have Kermit the Frog come up to bat, and baseball simulation, where the point was to try to recreate what actually happened in real life. Now, one of the most impressive parts of this game is how accurate it is. I rigged together a quick analysis of probable batting averages for all players who received cards, and the expected batting averages are dead on, as you can see here. Expected home runs were also dead on. But the really crazy part is that doubles and triples were also dead on. This is one of the first mysteries of National Pastime. You see, this game was originally published in December 1930. This is long before those statistics were officially published. I've been working for almost 2 years now trying to figure out how Clifford did it. The problem is that the first advertisements for National Pastime showed up in December 1930. This is the back page of the December 11th, 1930 issue of the Sporting News. The ad is at the very bottom right. Here's a closer image. This is the only time a National Pastime advertisement showed up in the Sporting News, and yes, I checked. There's also an advertisement in the December 1930 issue of Baseball Magazine, which I think might have actually gone on the newsstand as early as December 1st. This one is a bit easier to see. It's on page 326. This is back when the pages were numbered by volume, not individual issue. This was almost certainly a more effective ad since you can actually read it. It was larger and contained more information about the game. There's another ad in the January 1931 issue of Baseball Magazine, and I think most people don't know about this one. This one is also very easy to find and is the same as the December 1930 ad. I'm not sure if there were other ads in 1931 since I haven't bought every issue of the magazine. But the problem is that the Spalding and Reach baseball guides, the guides that had all the stats, well, those guides were not released until early April 1931. Now, Van Beek might have used the Sporting News as his source. This list of American League stats comes from the December 4th, 1930 issue of the Sporting News. That's 1 week before the first National Pastime Sporting News ad came out. So that gives him, like a week to create the whole game? But then we have to ignore that Baseball Magazine ad, and the other problem is that those are only the American League stats. The National League stats were not published in the Sporting News until January 1st, 1931. I mean, maybe Clifford just collected orders and waited a few months before sending the cards out, but I really don't buy it. I mean, you don't do stuff like that if you just started your own business and took on a whole lot of financial risk to make it work. I honestly think that he had a different statistical source. These are the final American League averages as printed in the Chicago Tribune on October 5th, 1930. But notice that there were no records of doubles or triples. Now here are the National League stats from the same issue. You should also note that a lot of players who receive National Pastime cards are not listed here. Okay, I'll tell you what I think really happened, and I've gone back and forth on this over the last 2 years. I think that Clifford Van Beek very likely calculated his own stats straight from box scores. Now that sounds unusually cumbersome, but there's actually quite a bit of evidence for this. This ugly thing is a scan of a 1930 box score from the Sporting News. It's illegible, but that's because the original microfilm was of very poor quality. The original was quite legible. Here's the same box score from the Chicago Tribune. This is probably more like what the Sporting News box scores looked like, and I'm convinced that Van Beek used this as his source. I'm also certain that it was the Sporting News that he used. So it turns out that the local newspaper in Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is where Van Beek lived, didn't actually print daily box scores. And it wasn't unusual in those days for papers outside of major cities to just simply not print box scores. You'll notice that this box score lists doubles, triples, and home runs per batter. However, it does not list walks or strikeouts by batter. Those are listed by a pitcher. But the baseball guides in those days did list walks and strikeouts by batter. Now, I need to emphasize here that box scores back in those days were uniform. They came from the same source and had been that way since the 19th century. Every single paper used the same box scores in the same format. In other words, if you look through all of the daily papers everywhere, you're not going to find some magic box score somewhere that includes batter walks and batter strikeouts. It didn't exist. Trust me, I looked. Anyway, if we assume that Clifford Van Beek used box scores and not the guide, we would expect his players to not realistically reproduce their real-life walks and strikeouts. And the amazing thing is that is exactly what we see. Walks and strikeouts in National Pastime are generally off. Strikeouts seem a bit closer to real life, but the walks are seriously off. But of course, that's not really proof. There is another element here, though, that most people miss. That would be the lineup sheet. Well, this picture isn't very good, but if you look closely, you can see the original yellow National Pastime lineup sheet. Fortunately, the original sheet has been scanned. I was curious about how accurate these lineups were, and so, a little over a year and a half ago, I dug in. It turns out that they're almost exactly right. Let's look at an example here. This is what Van Beek came up with for the Chicago Cubs: Blair, English, Collier, Wilson, and so on. This is what Baseball Reference lists based on original game accounts. Van Beek hit the most common lineup perfectly. Here's what Van Beek has for the Philadelphia Athletics, who of course wound up winning the World Series. The players are all correct in Van Beek's lineup, though if you look closely, you can see that Clifford switched up Haas and Dykes. But if you look at the day-by-day lineups, you'll see that Van Beek's lineups were the best reflection of what the Athletics actually put out in the month of September. There is no way for me to exaggerate just how impressive this is. Van Beek hit 15 of the 16 teams dead on, and I mean dead on. The only exception was the Chicago White Sox, and rumor has it that Van Beek may have actually been a White Sox fan. He might have made a couple of editorial changes to the lineup in hopes of getting them to play better. I can't think of any way that Clifford Van Beek could have done this so accurately without having gone through each box score one by one. Now, I could go on for hours and hours about all the cool stuff and mysteries behind this game, but I'll keep it simple for you guys. Well, if you dig in, you can see certain patterns in the playing cards. It looks like Clifford Van Beek created two different model cards, one for right-handed batters and one for both lefties and switch hitters. That's right, that means that there was kind of a righty-lefty system in National Pastime. This is the one for right-handed batters. Note that I only traced the out numbers and left off walks and strikeouts. And here is the one for left-handed batters. Now, if you want, you could use these templates to make your own National Pastime cards, but there are a few things you're going to have to keep in mind. Well, it seems that Van Beek started with the hit numbers. His goal was to get batting averages exactly right. Van Beek likely used play results 14 and 36 through 40 to fine-tune the number of at-bats players received. At-bats, of course, is the denominator in the batting average formula. Now, I still don't know how he assigned play result number 13, and there are still a few mysteries about exactly how different numbers were assigned. If you want more details, you can check out my blog. Okay, why in the world would you even want to think about making your own National Pastime cards? Well, it turns out that Van Beek only created 18 players per team, 5 pitchers, 8 starters, and 5 bench players. I presume this is because he could fit 9 different cards on each sheet that was printed, which is similar to how printing is today. Anyway, having only 18 players per team makes going through a full season replay really hard. Of course, if you don't mind potentially overusing players and you want the authentic original experience, you could just use the cards provided. Well, that's kind of what I've done here. In honor of this game, I finally sat down with the reprinted version of the game and replayed the 1930 World Series. Okay, I'll spare you the suspense. The Athletics won the World Series in 5 games, and those 5 games were not particularly close games either. Al Simmons hit 3 3-run homers in the first 3 games and went 3 for 6 in the final game. The Athletics won that final game 18-1. There's absolutely no question about who the most valuable player was. Well, I did notice a few issues with this game while I was playing it. This is stuff that most of you guys probably already know about. For one thing, there is absolutely no pitching system. In fact, it doesn't really matter who you pitch or who you put into the field. There's no reason to put in a relief pitcher, and you could do ridiculous things like have Jimmy Dykes pitch to open up another roster spot for a good hitter. In other words, you're going to have to create some homebrew rules to keep things from getting way out of hand. The other problem is that there's no way to control when players bunt to bring the infield in or to do anything that a normal baseball manager would do. I had a player attempt to sacrifice bunt with runners on second and third and 2 men out, for example. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do to stop it, unless you cheat, that is. And then there's no fielding system either. Well, there kind of is one. It turns out that Clifford Van Beek gave an extra air number or two to the teams that fielded best, which means that their opponents will commit more errors in a full season replay. It's pretty ingenious. In my opinion, however, the positives outweigh the negatives. For one thing, the game is extremely easy to play, much easier than any current baseball sim. The cards I played with, a reprint of the complete set that was reprinted in 2003, are also extremely attractive and eye-catching. Actually, though, the original cards looked even better. And the cool part is that the cards feature 2 different back colors, something that reminds me a lot of the old 1951 Topps baseball set. Anyway, it's a great game. It was also about 20 years ahead of its time when it first came out, but the game ended up failing. Why? Well, in the 1970s, after the baseball sim community discovered him and his game, Clifford Van Beek claimed that the printing company he contracted with went out of business. It's a good story, but it's also completely wrong. Actually, the printer sued Clifford Van Beek in 1932 for not paying the full cost of the game. The printer won, and Van Beek's major games company went out of business. Why? Well, the game clearly did not sell. Now, I do think that the barely legible Sporting News ad probably didn't help. And don't get your hopes up too much about those nice-looking Baseball Magazine ads. In fact, that December 1930 issue of Baseball Magazine features a long article about professional football, of all things. And the January 1931 issue features a long article about ice hockey. Yeah, the truth is that kids didn't really have baseball on the mind in December and in January. Now, I strongly suspect that Clifford wanted to hit those Christmas season sales, but it looks like he didn't quite do enough to make it work. And so he went under. Van Beek was also clearly the victim of hard economic times when credit was really hard to come by. And as you probably already know, small businesses like YouTube channels and blogs need time and space to grow before they can be successful. Even the most successful among us had to go through years in the red before finally hitting the black. Well, and there you have it. Now, normally I would tell you guys that I'm willing to sell my reprinted set, but not quite yet. I'm actually planning on using this to do a full season replay, and I mean an original replay, no pitching system. We're going to go by the original rules. I'll tell you all about it once I'm done. Now, as far as Clifford Van Beek is concerned, the obscure creator of the first baseball sim, well, I think that the best justice we can do to him is to keep talking about him. I just hope that this video and that my blog do him justice.